watcher, perhaps you're a designer or a publisher and you're thinking about naming your company and/or a board game. Well, I'm not an expert maybe on naming companies or board games, but I do think the name of a game or company is really important. And I'm here to give you some tips on this. Now, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, if a couple of you listen to this, I won't be too upset. So let's get started. Number one, first of all, don't name your company after your first game. Your first game might be Dungeon Delve, and then you name your company Dungeon Delve Incorporated. Why would you do that? There's many reasons not to do that. But first of all, your first game may be a flop. Do you want your company to be named after your floppy game? I don't think so. And you may come up with a game that's bigger than that, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's right. And you're always associated with that game. And this is not very original either. You want something else. Many people are like, well, that's the only game I'm probably ever going to make. I can't tell you how many times that hasn't happened, so be careful on that. Think of a cool name for your company. Secondly, spelling. Yes. I know it's really cool to change all the I's to Y's and the C's to K's, or put in some really weird, funky name. And you're like, yeah, that looks cool. Yeah, well, it does look cool. The problem is, many times, games are talked about. Word of mouth is a big thing about games. And when I say, hey, there's this great new game called Xenoshift, and people are like, oh, and I'm like, oh, by the way, Xenoshift is spelled X-E-N-O. Oh, and there's a Y in it instead of I. Oh. Okay, and they have to write that down or something because they're not going to remember when they're doing that in a search engine. And I can't tell you how many times I have a hard time like, oh, that's a really fun game, and I can't find it here. Well, the spelling is weird, or it's something that's usually two words, and then put it together as one word. And think about that. I mean, there is certainly that interesting factor in changing an I to a Y or some other letters or something else. Again, kind of like distinguishes your game maybe a little bit, but it can be very difficult for people to search. Now, at the same time, you don't want to go to the other extreme. And number three, don't pick generic names. Oh, come on now. Calling your game some name that is just like The Battle of the Bulge, 1945. Well, what does that even mean? I mean, yeah, there's a lot of games. We all know what The Battle of the Bulge is, or you call your game The Game, or something that's just very generic and very boring, and it's kind of like, there are many times someone says, hey, we have a new game coming out, and they'll say the name, and they're like, okay, but what is it? What does that mean? Generic is not interesting. You want something that distinguishes you above everybody else. Length. I don't think your game needs to be called Space Exploration, the game of exploring space. And that's, first of all, it's very redundant. But secondly, just really long names in general. And most people don't want to do that. In the online community, we're constantly shortening things down. And here, we're just using initials for names of games. And they will do that to shorter names, let alone really lengthy names like, And that leads me into my next point, which is no one uses subtitles. You can make a cool subtitle for your game, but nobody is going to use it. Even the biggest game around, Magic the Gathering, how many people say that? Most people say Magic. Online, it's M:TG, right? Now, that's not a big deal. That subtitle is actually a pretty good one because it differentiates the game rather than just being called Magic. But there are many games behind me where they have a perfectly fine name, and then they have a subtitle for them that no one uses. And when someone does use it, someone will say, Is that an expansion? Just recently, there was a game, a very popular game, Spectre Ops, and Spectre Ops has the subtitle Tower of Babel or Spectres of Babel. I don't even remember what the subtitle is. It's on the screen, I'm sure. And when someone was doing a list, and they split that and Spectre Ops. They thought it was an expansion, but it's not. It's the same game. So be cautious with that. It even gets more exasperated when there are two versions of the game, and each has a different subtitle, and that's how you distinguish them, but no one ever remembered the subtitle anyway. Then, there may be another game out there with that name already. Now, you might say, hey, no one has ever heard of that other game, but it still can cause confusion. All the great game names have not been used up, and it's not that difficult to do a search on the internet and say, Does the name of this game already exist? Maybe it's a popular video game. Maybe it's something else that people will know instantly, and that's fine to some degree, but you really got to think about that. You don't want any confusion out there. You want, when someone searches for the name of your game or the name of your company, they should find your game or your company as one of the top things on that search engine. There are so many games, and this goes back to generic, where I'm searching for them and I have to put in this, a board game by this company, and otherwise I would not find them on the internet. Google is your friend. People want to use Google to find us, make it easier for them. Exclamation point! Just because you put them after the name of your game doesn't make it more exciting, and I'm getting tired of seeing them in games, and obviously this is a personal preference, but seriously, and having more than one exclamation point doesn't make it that much better. Okay, don't be misleading with your game name. All right, if your game is about one thing, don't call it something else. Sometimes I'm not sure why the name of a game is picked, but when you say the name of a game, no one's ever going to do it. One of the funniest is a game that came out years ago called Barbarossa, which has nothing to do with Barbarossa or any battles that happened at Barbarossa. It's about clay, and whatever reasoning they picked that name for, if I say Barbarossa to you, you're not going to think, oh, that's a party game where you're making models out of clay. No. So when you make the title of your game, try to make it so that people, when they hear it, they're like, oh, it kind of gives them an idea of what the game is about. Same with your company. If your company has dice in the title, then perhaps you should put dice in your games. If it has mini in the title or whatever, be cautious when you name your company, because your company name may sound like one thing and you're publishing games that are something else. Then there is the font and the logos. This isn't necessarily the actual picking of the name for your company or whatever, but when you're making your logo or your company, I should be able to look at your logo, instantly say, that's that company. And the logo should be simple, it should be clean, it should be able to see the name on it, and when I have your game, and whatever your game might be, I should be able to look at it and be able to read that name. Hey, that name is there, boom, I can read it. It shouldn't be in some weird, I used Elvish font. Can anyone read that? Is that an L or is that a 1? What does exactly that say? How do you pronounce that thing? You got to be cautious. Think about that. The font and the logo, if they're confusing and hard to read, well, I would consider changing them. And finally, when you're making your game, make sure that the title of your game is the focus. Don't have other words dwarfing it. Don't have these stupid things like, a great game. Okay, well, great. I'm glad it's a great game. But put the title there. Don't have it dwarfed by other things or have it small in the box or hard for people to find. There are so many companies that are coming out these days, and it's hard to think of a new, unusual name, and you'll probably think of a really cool name, do a search, and find that someone has picked it. But keep trying. Same thing for games. But many of my favorite games have names that as soon as I hear them, I know exactly what that game is. I know a little bit of what it's about. I don't know, in the comments here, tell me what are your biggest pet peeves when people name games or companies. Maybe you disagree with something I've said. Maybe there's something I've forgotten. Let me know. Anyway, until next time, I'm Tom Vasel, and you've been watching The Dice Tower.